We are back to still in our series in the book of Ephesians. Gonna finish the message that we started last week. Just had some great testimonies last Sunday and kind of began this message that I entitled Stepping Up to Submission. Dealing with relationships and how we are, Ephesians chapter 5 verse 21, submit to one another. And how that works. Paul lays that out for husbands, wives, parents, children, masters, and slaves. And we're going to jump back into that again. Want to launch from a statement that the Apostle Paul made in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, where he said, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Well, Father, thank you for the roles that you've developed within the family, within government, within the household. And Lord, you've called each of us to humble ourselves and to submit to others within those institutions. In marriage, in the home, in the workplace. Father, would you grant us hearts of humility that recognize your design, your order, and our responsibility in that. And Father, we thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. So here Paul says, in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, bond nor free, slave nor free, all are one. Now, Paul's not saying there's no difference between men and women, right? That point needs to be made today. There's no difference between your ethnicity, Jews and Gentiles, everybody. No, that's not what he's saying. He says all are on the same footing. So I began last week, and just kind of trying to hurry through this first point. We're going to kind of recap that again this morning. In your bulletins, the first points are filled in already. But the gospel, I mentioned last week, the gospel recognizes the value, the worth of all people. And here's what I mean by that. The gospel, the central message of biblical Christianity, the message of the church, the main, boil it all down, the main message of biblical Christianity, the gospel, means good news. The good news is we were all created in God's image, right? We're all created in God's image. God makes no mistakes. But all of us have chosen to rebel against God. We've all broken his laws, right? Just start with the 10 Commandments, kind of boil down the law of God. We've all lied. We've all stolen. Jesus said, if you hate your neighbor, you're guilty of murder already. If you look with lust upon someone, you've already committed adultery already. We've all broken God's law, right? And we stand guilty before a holy God. We're all guilty. A foot around the cross is all level, right? We're all guilty. It's not, well, this person's like really close to God. Here's God, and here's this guy, and here's this guy. No, here's God, here's everybody else, right? From Mother Teresa to Adolf Hitler and everybody in between, we have all broken God's law. So what did God do? What did God do for guilty sinners like you and me? He gave his son to pay the penalty. We can't pay the penalty. We can't go to church enough. We can't do enough good things. Some religious systems say, oh, if the good outweighs the bad, then you go to heaven. If the bad outweighs the good, you go to hell. No, we're all bound for hell. All of us are guilty, right? What God calls us to do is trust in what he has done through his son. Trust that Jesus died for me. Every one of my filthy sins, he died for me. He asks us to put our trust in him, stop trusting in ourselves, our own ability, our own moral goodness, and trust in what he has done. Amen. That's the gospel. It's the Christian message. That's the message of the church. We're all guilty. We all must trust Christ, not trust, well, my parents were Christian, I was brought up Christian, my dog tag says Christian. We're all guilty before God. What God did for us is gave his son to pay the penalty that I could not pay. And he simply asks us to trust in him, right? So the gospel Recognize the value and worth of all people. All of us are made in God's image. Regardless of what society says, societies, cultures, all have this pecking order of these people are most important and these people are just under them. Well, these people, they're no good. Right? The gospel does not recognize that. Societies create that. God says, you are all created by me. You all need to repent, turn from your sin, trust in me. So in Paul's day, and here he's in this section, starting chapter 5, verse 22. We're in the first 9 verses of chapter 6 now, but he starts this section, what is called household codes, which means the gospel working within the framework of our daily lives. Husbands and wives, we dealt with that, 2 weeks ago? Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives and do everything you can, right, to serve them. Mutual submission, submitting to one another. Wives, submit to your husband's leadership. Husbands, submit to your wife's needs, right? Mutual submission. And then last week, we began to look at parents and children. Parents, children first, obey your parents, right? Submit to your parents. Parents, submit to teaching, being committed to teaching your children, instructing your children. And then slaves and masters. And I think most of our time this morning we'll deal with that. Mutual submission. What does that look like? Again, Paul's teaching in his day was a great offense. It was greatly offensive to husbands. I mean, I got to treat my wife like she's my equal. My culture doesn't teach that. The husband, the wife, and animals and children, right? It was a great offense to husbands. It was a great offense to parents. Parents, you need to be intentional about instructing your children. Oh, no, kids are just supposed to do whatever they're told. It was a great offense to parents, and it was certainly a great offense to masters. Masters, treat your slaves like you would want to be treated. Today, it's just the reverse, right? This passage, a great offense to women. Oh, I got to submit to that gorilla. And children, they ought to be free to just do whatever they want to. Slaves, are you kidding me? They need to submit to their masters. Both of those constructs are based on pride, right? The superiority of husbands and parents and masters, or the superiority of wives and children and slaves. Both of those are built on pride. God calls us to humble ourselves and to submit where he has put us, where we find ourselves in social structure. Does that make sense? And again, 2 weeks ago, we looked quite a bit about God's design, God's order. And man's order is just like whoever you fight your way to the top, and wherever you can end up, as high as you can climb, you climb there. God has order for the marriage. God has order, design for the family. God has order and design for the workplace. And let's jump into that. So we're back to Ephesians chapter 6. I want to just recap real quick because we dealt with it a bit last week, although we had a lot going on. There was some good stuff last week. Applying submission to the home, the first 4 verses. And I just want to kind of recap a little bit about what we talked about there. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And all the parents said, hallelujah. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So we're looking throughout these 3 relationships, marriage, home, the workplace. I wanted us to look first at God's design for that, and then the responsibility that each member has. Won't go back over all of that. You can watch last 2 weeks' messages on our website. But first we dealt with the responsibility of children. Paul spends what we call 3 verses here on that. God's design is that parents walk with God, they'll grow in wisdom of God, there'll be a mutual submission, right? The wife submitting to to the husband's leadership, helping him be a good leader, because most, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, most guys aren't good leaders naturally. And the husband submitting to his wife to serve her and her needs and create an atmosphere where she can grow, right? That mutual submission and creating an environment where they're able to teach and demonstrate the wisdom of God to their children, right? And children are to pay attention, learn, grow. A healthy home is where children learn to respect elders and authority in their lives. Why? Because someday they're going to be elderly and in authority, right? Leads to a healthy society. 30 years ago, our children were 10, 8, 6, 4, and the thought that someday they're going to be the authority in our society was like, dear Lord, help us all. Where's that going? Today, our kids now all in their 30s, and they are leaders in their realm, the church, in their workplace, in their communities, and the circles that they run in. And that's the way it's supposed to work, right? And we're left saying, dear Lord, I hope I did a decent job, right? When a society, and he said, honor your father and mother so that it'll go well with you, you'll live long on the earth. When a culture, when a society is built on the younger, honoring, respecting the older, just life goes better for everybody, right? And people live longer, and because chances are we're all going to be old one day. And we're sure hoping we live in a society where the younger honor the older, right? So we teach that to our children. Hopefully we were taught that. The responsibility of children. And then the responsibility of parents. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. What a beautiful balance. This, again, a parallel passage in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 21. Fathers, do not provoke your children or they will become discouraged. And what a beautiful balance here of God's design, God's order, God's wisdom, mutual submission. Children, submit to the leadership, authority of your parents. Parents, submit to the needs of your children. Be intentional about teaching them, raising them up, right? So why does Paul go from children, obey your parents, and then to fathers, do not provoke your children? I think Paul is simply recognizing the leadership role that the husband has been called to and his responsibility for that. And what is it that causes children to be angry and discouraged, frustrated? Well, and we looked at a list last week and kind of threw out a bunch of various ways that parents can do that with their kids, that really being too strict, having no grace, or being too lenient, having no boundaries whatsoever, right? Too permissive. And the age-old adage, rules without relationship leads to rebellion, right? That works in the parent-child relationship. It works it's true in the workplace. It's true in the home. Rules without relationship, do this. Why? Because I told you to. Without any relationship, parents need to relate, right? To relate to their children. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion, where it's just nothing but rules. You see that in church. There's no relationship. It's all just you do this. Without building relationship leads to rebellion. We see that throughout human history. All of that to say parents desperately need God's wisdom, God's grace, God's patience to fulfill their responsibility. Huh? Don't let the culture raise your children. Don't let TikTok and Hollywood raise your children, right? And again, we're not raising children, we're raising adults. Parenting 101. We're not raising children, we're raising adults. Raising productive citizens. Number one, to be citizens of God's kingdom. Two, to be citizens in this earthly kingdom. So applying submission to the home. Children, obey. Parents, instruct, submitting to one another. Does that make sense? We've looked at husbands and wives. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. We looked at Parents and children. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger. Don't discourage them. And third, to conclude this section of Paul's letter that we call household codes, applying the gospel, this mutual submission thing to the various relationships in our lives. Applying submission to the workplace, the second point we didn't get to last week. I was going to try and do all of this in one message. Husbands, wives, parents, children, masters, slaves. That quickly became a, what are you thinking? Applying submission to the workplace, verses 5 through 9. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with goodwill, as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Why would Paul put this slave-master relationship thing under household codes? Or why would we include that? Why would theologians, Bible students, put under this household codes kind of heading the slave-master responsibility? Well, because in the first century Roman Empire, many slaves were domestic servants. They were part of the home, they were part of the household, they were part of the family. So I want us to look this morning at what was this thing about slavery, because the word does something in our hearts, doesn't it? Oh, slaves? Oh, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to God deals with it, right? God recognizes it. So I want us to look at first century slavery, what it was and what it wasn't, and then application for us today in these verses, Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9. Today, when we hear the word slavery, we think of all kinds of things, don't we? We think of slave trade through the last several centuries in Africa, Europe, United States. Maybe you think about human trafficking, which is just a blight on humanity today, and more awareness of that, and ministries whole ministries are targeting that whole thing. Maybe you think about sweatshops and forced labor of children, forced labor of women around the world. Think of all kind of things. When we think that word slavery, it certainly triggers something in our hearts. Slavery. Slavery in the first century Roman Empire was a good bit different than the slavery that we think about in later history, and certainly in the United States and largely in the South, and much different. We are told that 25 to 40% of the Roman Empire, population of the Roman Empire, were slaves. 120 million population of the Roman Empire at the time Paul wrote this letter, and somewhere around 40 million, say a third, were slaves. It was huge. It was not just like we think about slavery based on racial lines, race-based, horrendous race-based slavery, right? In the Roman Empire, it was really socioeconomic. All kinds of people were masters, all kinds of people were slaves. It really didn't have anything to do with where you come from. For some time during the Roman Empire, Roman citizens could not be, they were freedmen, period, but that changed in time, and even Roman citizens could be slaves. And it kind of shook down, oversimplified, but kind of shook down. If you had money and a name, you were a master. You owned property, and good chance You own people. If you didn't have a recognized name and you didn't have money, good chance you would be working for someone else. It was sort of what drove the entire economy. Listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 20 and following, 20 to 24. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a slave is a freedman of the Lord. See what he's saying there? If you're in the social, like bottom of the heap, you are free in Jesus. If God called you, if you were introduced to the gospel and you put your trust in Jesus, you were a slave, don't worry about it. You're free on the inside. If you get a chance to be free, take that chance, right? He who called you in the Lord, he who was called in the Lord as a slave, as a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when he was called is a slave of Christ. Paul says elsewhere, we're all slaves. Every man's a slave. You're either a slave to sin or you're a slave to Christ, right? We're all, in that sense, slaves. You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. What? A whole lot going on there. Came across a quote by Pastor John MacArthur this week. John MacArthur has pastored for over 50 years in the same church in Southern California. And he says this concerning this passage in 1 Corinthians 7. New Testament teaching does not focus on reforming and restructuring human systems, which are never the root cause of human problems. The issue is always the heart of man, which, when wicked, will corrupt the best of systems, and when righteous, will improve the worst. If men's sinful hearts are not changed, they will find ways to oppress others regardless of whether or not there is actual slavery. You see what he's saying there? The gospel, the primary focus of the gospel is not to reform culture, right? Not to reform culture, social reform. The primary objective of the gospel is to transform individual hearts. And when individual hearts are changed, then real change happens in society. Does that make sense? And yes, we ought to be concerned about the plight of others. We ought to be concerned about marginalized people for the sake of who they are, where they came from. But the primary call of the gospel, primary job one of the gospel isn't to change governmental systems, it's to change hearts. And men will change hearts. That's why around the world, you'll see where the gospel has been allowed to be propagated, where the gospel has been embraced, the plight of women, children, various ethnic groups is always elevated. And we see that around the world. But today, in the last 50 to 100 years, we have seen what theologians call liberation theology. And we see it growing in the West, North America, and Europe as well today. With the religion, the church, the Bible, primary concern ought to be to bring social reform and make everybody's earthly situation equal. Now that's a byproduct of the gospel, isn't it? That's a result of the gospel. But I believe firmly that first and foremost, the purpose of the gospel is to change individual hearts. I hope you understand. I hope I'm explaining myself. And what I think the Bible clearly teaches, not reforming governmental systems and social reform, but spiritual, individual reform. Think of it this way. Two young men, any time in history you want to pick in the last 2,000 years, two young men, one from a ruling class family, one from a servant class family. And the gospel has reached both these young men, transformed their hearts, and use your imagination, but somehow, maybe in the evening when no one's looking, the two of them can slip away and they can have fellowship in the Lord because God has transformed their hearts. The ruling class young man, his family hates the servant class young man's family and vice versa, right? But because God has done a work in their hearts, they can slip away and they can have fellowship because the gospel transcends earthly systems. The gospel transcends human social systems. And in that scenario, the young man from the ruling class is able to say to his friend from the servant class, brother, I love you, you know I love you, and it just pains me to see what my family says about you. And the other young man from the servant class can say, brother, I love you, and it pains me, the hatred that my circle has for your circle, right? But the gospel can elevate them, and both of them can say, we're going to spend the rest of our days trying to change this earthly situation, but the primary focus of the gospel is spiritual reform, not social reform. Any of that makes sense, then you're fortunate. All right. In my limited travels around the world, all over the United States, working with church leaders and in Mexico and Central America and South America and West Africa, dealing with church leaders in all those, in those parts of the world, my first reaction as a crazy, blessed North American guy, my first response is, oh my, how can you live like this? You have nothing. And questions to me about what my hut looks like. I change the subject. And my heart just breaks. And yet, as we begin to fellowship, usually through a translator, we realize it really doesn't matter what our earthly situation is. The gospel elevates us, and we have fellowship with one another. I've seen it all over the world, all over the United States, where people in other countries will say, yeah, I mean, we could build more churches if we had your money, but we really don't want your money. We want you to pray for us that we would be effective where we're at. And that really allows you to put your heart in check, like, dear Lord, I wish I had that simple faith. They're not looking to be like Americans. Most of the world's not looking to be like Americans. Believers around the world are looking to be like Jesus, and they want to be effective in where they're at. The purpose of the gospel is to bring spiritual transformation. So in Paul's day, husbands, wives, parents, children, masters, slaves, they were all together in church together. As Paul sends this letter to the city of Ephesus and all the home churches that would have made up the church there in Ephesus, Paul expected this letter to be written, to be read to everybody in church. And there's a master and a slave maybe sitting next to each other. And he's saying, hey, slave, you obey this guy. Master, you treat him like you want to be treated. There'll be a husband and wife. And wives, you submit to his leadership. Husband, you give your life for her. And parents and children sitting together. Kiddos, recognize your parents' authority over you. And parents, pour yourself into your children, right? They're all together, and he's speaking to all of them. Wouldn't you love to have been a fly on a camel in that thing? And to hear, especially this slave master thing, and to hear that go down, and Paul is sternly teaching, slaves, be obedient. Masters, be kind. But Paul's not here speaking to government officials, hey guys, you need to change your policies. That would come. That part of the world has changed greatly since the time of the Caesars. He wasn't talking to government officials about their policies. He was speaking to Christ followers, right? You're a slave, you call yourself a Christ follower, demonstrate Christ even in your difficult situation. You're a Christ follower as a master, demonstrate Christ in the way you lead the realm that God has given you. So, the whole thing about does the Bible condone slavery? And you've probably heard that. Maybe you have friends that say, the Bible just supports slavery. Yeah, not so fast. On the one hand, Paul was not trying to launch a revolution to change the cultural norms of the Roman Empire, right? He didn't give much attention to that whatsoever. I think Paul didn't really care who was in charge earthly. He knew who was in charge heavenly. On the other hand, Paul was launching a revolution to change the hearts of men. And that is his mission strategy. That is the mission strategy of missionaries around the world today. You don't just go into a place that is foreign to you, different cultural customs, and start saying you need to quit eating that and start eating this. You need to quit wearing that and start dressing like Westerners or something. You don't do it. You bring the gospel, let it change hearts, and you let them do with what they believe Jesus is calling them to do and some of their cultural things, right? Even the social structure. The Bible does not condone slavery. It mentions it. God mentions slavery because it's a natural result of fallen men, right? He mentions it as a reality. It was never God's design, never God's desire, slavery, but it was a natural result of men's fallen hearts. And God mentions it like he mentions polygamy, men being married to multiple wives or vice versa, or divorce. God didn't condone those things. He recognizes them as reality. Can we agree on that? Or let me say, chew on that, if you would, a little bit. So let's take a look at the responsibility of servants. Now, this word is variously translated in your Bible version as slaves, bond slaves, servant, bond servants. Slaves is just kind of, and rightly so, kind of a triggering word. I use the softer word servants. It's the same word, right? The responsibility of servants, especially Christian servants. The servant, slave, bond slave, whatever English term you want to use, that has no regard for Christ, doesn't care about Christ, well, do your thing and best of luck to you. But he is speaking specifically to Christian servants, right? Again, verses 5 through 8, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by way of eye service or people-pleasing, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with goodwill as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Responsibility of servants, slaves, obey your earthly masters as you would obey the Lord. Because your ultimate master, the ultimate master of every believer is the Lord, right? You know, we serve the Lord by serving the authority that we've been placed under. Part of walking with God is respectful, humble submission to earthly authority, regardless of our situation. And everything in us says, you got to be kidding me. Paul would say that to slaves. Some in first century Roman Empire, slaves were tutors, teachers, physicians, household managers. Some were cooks. Some did menial labor, worked in the mines, very, very difficult work, wide variety. Some, during some portions of the Roman Empire, a master could set the slave free, and that slave would take with him or her the name and the status of their master. Some were treated brutally, cruel. Some were treated very, very well. As I say, there were doctors and so a wide variety. Wasn't race-based, but socioeconomic based. And it just seems, as we think of this, slaves, obey your masters, tell me it doesn't just strike you a little bit on the inside, like, Are you kidding me? Does that sound cruel? Let me try to speak to that. Perhaps God looks below the surface, looks beyond the external, beyond the earthly status, and looks to the heart. And it's difficult for us to hear this, but a slave in the worst of conditions who knows the Lord Jesus, maybe they live 100 years, will walk for eternity with the resurrected Jesus. And from eternity's perspective, it looks a whole lot different, doesn't it? So Paul says, wherever you find yourself, serve the Lord. Eternity's worth it. We're reminded of God's word to Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, where Samuel, he's looking for the next king to replace King Saul. Goes to the house of David the youngest. Here's all my sons. David, the youngster, he's out tending sheep, but brings out his oldest. Jesse brings out his oldest. Oh, you're going to like this guy, Samuel. And God says to Samuel, yeah, no, that's not the one. All right, well, who's your next? And brings out the next son. Oh, this one looks good. And Samuel said, that's not. He goes through the list. And Samuel says, no, God's not all over any of your boys. You got anybody else? Oh, well, we got young David. He's out tending sheep. You're not going to want anything to do with him. And he comes in before Samuel, and God says, that's the one. For God, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. Could it be that God looks past our social status, whether it's really high in the society we live in or really low? Could it be that God looks beyond our earthly social status and looks to our heart? Now, I recognize without a renewed mind, Ephesians 4, verse 23, we looked at that whenever we were back in chapter 4. Renewing your minds. If our minds are not renewed, we're not thinking the way God thinks, then that makes no sense whatsoever, right? This is just crazy. Like, that's not fair. A servant, a slave is supposed to just obey as they would the Lord. That's not fair. May I say the gospel is not fair. Because the king took my place, died in my place. The king, my creator, hung on a cross and served me. Is that fair? The gospel is not fair. It is grace. And he just asked me, wherever you find yourself, wherever I put you in society today, you humble yourself and you obey the authority that you're under. Why? Why must we honor and respect the authority that we're under? Because God put us there. That's a hard pill to swallow. But we are accountable to God. God, this is where I find myself. And maybe we are where we were by our own bad choices or something, but that's where we are, and God says, I want you to serve Christ right where you're at. That 1 Corinthians chapter 7 passage is the ultimate bloom where you're planted passage, right? Well, if I was just in a better situation, I'd really be serving God. If I made more money, I'd really be serving God. If I was a foreman on my crew, I'd really be serving. No, if you're not serving God, you wouldn't be serving God wherever you're at, right? Wherever we're at, bloom where you're planted. I could go on for quite a while on that. With fear and trembling, he says, with respect and humility, because we will give account to God for our actions, for our attitudes. Today, tell me if I'm wrong, but today, we've got the sentiment in our culture of the underdog, right? The little guy has no need whatsoever to humble themselves, right? Because he's already got a hard time. And for that guy, there's no limits to his arrogance and pride because we'll look at what he has to put up with. That is not of God, right? Oh, he doesn't have to. He can just be as proud and belligerent as he wants to because look where he's at. Or people who say, man, I've already experienced hell in this life, so when this life is over, obviously I'm going to heaven. That is not how it works, right? We are all guilty sinners. And no, you haven't experienced hell in this life. What we understand about hell, it is nothing like anybody experiences in this life. Or afflicted people are good, comfortable people are bad. That is not of God, right? Again, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 20 to 24. Bloom where you're planted. If God calls you, you just serve God right where you're at. If you have a chance, Paul says very clearly, if you have a chance to be free, go for it. Right? If you have a chance to elevate your situation, then do it. But God's desire is to put his people throughout every layer of this crazy social order that we have created, right? What if everybody who came to Christ and they owned a Fortune 500 company and that was all where every believer was? That wouldn't work, right? God wants to put people throughout all of society, right? He wants to put people in the upstairs office in charge of things. He wants his people to be in the workforce. He wants people to be at what we would consider the lowest level of society. Does that make sense? God wants to sprinkle his people out throughout all of society that people will know. So, the slave thing, first century, we can apply that to Christian employees, to in the workplace, because really that's probably how we would apply, or we would say, well, that slavery thing doesn't happen where I live, so none of this, it applies to us, right? The Christian employees. Is the effort that we are giving to our employer, is the day of work that we're giving to our employer, is it a worthy offering to the Lord? That's the question, right, that Paul asks here. Is the heartfelt service to those in authority at work for me, is it a worthy offering to the Lord? Or is it like, I just do enough to get by? And that's a haunting question, isn't it? Is the product that we render our employers a worthy sacrifice of the Lord? Or do we want to present to God a good heart? Or do we just want to present to our boss and coworkers a good look? That's what Paul says when don't just serve your master with eye service as people pleasers. Do we want to present to God a good heart? Or do we just want to present to our boss and other coworkers a good look? When people are watching, I'm really getting after it, but if nobody's looking, then I'll do whatever, right? That's not always easy when you work for sinful humans. But God calls us to look past the boss, right? Calls us to look past the boss and to look to the boss of bosses, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Not as man pleasers, but as God pleasers, right? Because your earthly boss is not going to be around forever. Your heavenly boss, he's going to be around forever, right? And by the way, he is around always. Your earthly boss isn't always around. Your heavenly boss, yeah. So interesting, and I'm trying to hurry. Interesting here, Paul doesn't say, oh, you slaves, you poor things. God doesn't expect anything from you because look at your situation. He doesn't do that. He gives them dignity. You have responsibility. Maybe the world doesn't see you as worth much, but God says, I see you as worth a whole lot, and I have responsibility for you. And then verse 8, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Earthly employment leads to a temporary paycheck, which is gone quickly. Can I get an amen? Earthly employment leads to a temporary paycheck that is gone quickly. Service to God leads to eternal reward that will endure forever. Whether you're a bond servant or whether you're free, responsibility on both. In man's kingdom, you got, the big dog upstairs, then you got your managers, supervisors, whatever you want to call them, then you got the workforce, then you got the temporary help. In God's kingdom, we're all working for Jesus, right? And we need to work that way. Regardless of who or what our boss is, we're working for Jesus, and we need to do it with all of our hearts, with integrity and diligence, fear and trembling, Paul called it, respect with humility. And lastly, the responsibility of masters, pretty simple. Verse 9, masters, do the same to them. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with them. No partiality. So to Christian employers, Christian masters, treat your servants with dignity and respect, right? Just like he'd ask servants to treat you. They're fellow image bearers of God, right? Created in God's image. I think God, through Paul, is saying here, hey, masters, you're really not as special as you think you are, right? One touch from the Lord, and you are no longer able to think straight, right? You're not all as special as you think you are. He says, do the same to them. It was radical. It was radical in Paul's day. It's kind of radical today. Treat them with honor, respect, value, submission to one another, right? Servants, submit to your master, your boss, bosses, masters. Submit to the needs of your workforce. And again, in man's economy, the boss says, I'm big and you're little, right? In God's economy, God says, you're all little. You're all little. None of you are all that, right? And again, this is revolutionary in Paul's day. It's still in ours as well. Christian employers is to stop threatening. What's that about? Stop your threatening. I think it's stop with the words and attitudes that say, I have power over you. I can make your life miserable, or I can make your life, I've got power over you. Stop it. Stop it, right? Treat folks with respect. Humble yourselves. Treat your workers like you would want to be treated, because God is watching. Read a little illustration this week. I thought it was just great. Went something like this. A supervisor's got a subordinate employee who big time fail. They dropped the ball on something that they were supposed to do. And so this supervisor is on their way to give this subordinate a good old reprimand, piece of his mind. And another person in the structure says, yeah, you might want to be careful and remember that that's the boss's daughter. Oh, you think that would make a difference? You just might want to remember that the person you're going to reprimand is the boss's son. Isn't that great? Like, oh, yeah, masters, you might want to remember your subordinates are created in the image of God. God's sons, God's daughters. You might want to remember that, right? I thought it was good. Okay, you didn't like it. I thought it was great, by the way. So, as we wrap up this whole section of relationships, applying the gospel, submission, mutual submission to husbands and wives, parents and children, masters and slaves. Why does Paul give so much attention to marriage and to family and to the workplace? Because that's where the fruit of God's work in our lives is demonstrated. In those relationships, that's where the fruit of what God's doing in our lives is demonstrated. The world really isn't impressed, Christian friend, with your church attendance record. Oh, you go to church a lot. Well, that's great. The world really isn't impressed with your church attendance record. I've got a great one, by the way, just saying. The world is pretty interested in how husbands treat their wives, and how wives treat their husbands, how parents treat their children, and how children treat their parents, how bosses treat their employees and employees treat their bosses, right? That is what people say, oh, you are different. Oh, you've got a unique perspective. Couldn't help but think of this, and then we're done. When you break up a message in a couple weeks, it's like, how is this going to take 3 minutes? We couldn't have that. No, it's 45. I was in Marine Corps Reserve from 1976, year after I got out of high school, to 1982, and that's 6 years of my enlistment. I was a pagan the first 4 years and a Christian the last 2, completely different deal there. And in those last couple years, as a believer, I had this guy in our unit, and he just, maybe the boldest believer I've ever met in my life, constantly singing praise songs and witnessing everywhere he went, and just like almost obnoxiously joyful in the Lord. But he was a terrible Marine. Horrible, lazy as the day is long. He would skate out of, ghost around, and like, I don't want to do anything. I just want to sing Christian songs and little praise tunes that he would make up or whatever. A horrible worker. And I'm thinking like, dude, you just need to be quiet, because your walk is not measuring with your talk. And people aren't all that impressed with our talk about, I'm super religious and I know God. People want to know, what is God doing in us, right? What is the fruit of that? Has it changed the way we treat people? Has it changed the way we treat our job? I don't even remember the brother's name. But Paul says, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, submit to one another. And then he launches into these relationships, marriage, family, workplace. Back in chapter 4, verse 23, he says you need renewed minds. And none of this is going to make sense if we don't allow God to renew our minds, to see as God sees, huh? Applying submission to the workplace. Servants, obey. Masters, respect. And you see the beautiful design of God and human systems, and when that's happening, cultures blossom, societies thrive, and things are good. Let me close with just a simple, conclusion that I think this whole passage challenges us with. May we step up to our responsibility in every relationship in our lives, whether it's our marriage, whether it's with our children, in the workplace, in the neighborhood, in civic organizations. Let's step up to the responsibility to submitting to one another. Amen? Amen. Would you pray with me? Father, we thank you for allowing your Son to submit to us, to give himself for our sin. Lord, there's nothing about that is fair. There's nothing about that really makes sense. But Lord, it was the only way that you could keep your righteous nature intact and rescue us from separation from you. And Lord, you've set an example for us. Jesus, as you served us, you call us to serve those around us. Father, may we see, may we submit, may we recognize the beautiful design, the balance of design that you create in our human systems to submit to one another, to serve one another. Father, would you speak to our hearts in these closing moments about maybe our marriage, maybe our parenting, maybe our workplace. Would you speak to our hearts about how we relate to those around us? And are we truly submitting to the authority that you have placed in our lives? Lord, ultimately, may we submit to you. Lord, we thank you for your goodness. Thank you for allowing us to gather. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.